Wait, so picture this, right? You're 8 years old, and you're out with your friends, just biking around.
Yeah,
Summertime.
carefree.
No worries in the world. That feeling. You
Yeah.
got it. Hold on to that. Because what we're looking at today, it's a case where all that just gets ripped away.
Yeah, the West Memphis Three.
Oh, man.
A case that it gets you thinking, about the dark side of small town America for sure. Lots of controversy, a lot of questions, and a lot of doubt.
Absolutely. So we're talking about the murders of three 8-year-old boys, Steve Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore,
Back in 1993.
in Robin Hood Hills, Arkansas.
Seemingly a normal place, for kids to be playing, but
Right.
these boys, they were found in a creek. A muddy creek.
And the way they were found.
Yeah, the details, they're really what make this case just so disturbing. Hogtied.
With their own shoelaces,
Some naked.
some with their clothes, like twisted on sticks.
Why? What's the purpose?
It's a question that it hangs over everything. Right from the start, the crime scene was like something out of a nightmare. The brutality, the lack of any obvious motive.
And even the autopsy reports, they just add to that mystery. Byers. His cause of death was multiple injuries, but Moore and Branch, multiple injuries with drowning.
So immediately you're thinking, was it the drowning that killed them? Or did something else happen before they ended up in that creek?
Exactly. And that question, that ambiguity, it becomes like a thread. It runs through the whole case.
Before we get too far into all of that, though, the investigation, the theories, we have to remember the victims.
Absolutely.
Steve, Christopher, and Michael. They weren't just names on a police report. They were real kids. Kids with personalities, with dreams. Families that loved them.
Second graders. Just think about that for a second. Michael, he was the outgoing one. Always in his Cub Scout uniform.
Christopher, he was a little younger at heart, it seemed like. Still believed in Santa Claus.
Yeah. And Steve, he was the bright one. Honor student.
Right.
So much potential.
And their families, their lives were shattered. To lose a child like that, so suddenly, so violently, I can't even imagine.
And that question, who could do such a thing, it just hung over West Memphis.
That need to find an answer, to hold someone accountable. It's what drove the whole investigation. And in a small town like that, suspicion moves quickly.
And it fell on a group of teenagers. A group that, well, they stood out.
Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr.
The West Memphis Three. They were different. Long hair, dark clothes, into heavy metal music.
And the occult.
Yeah. In a town like West Memphis, a town that's, pretty traditional, pretty conservative, church on Sundays, these kids, they were outsiders.
Rebels. Troublemakers, maybe, in some people's eyes.
So you have this horrific crime, you have this community that's desperate for answers, and you have these teenagers who just don't fit in. It was a recipe for disaster, really.
And as the investigation went on, it became pretty clear that the case against them, against the West Memphis Three, it was circumstantial, to say the least.
More about speculation and fear than hard evidence.
There was no DNA linking them to the crime scene.
No witnesses placing them there at the time of the murders.
But there was one thing the prosecution kept coming back to.
Jesse Miskelly's confession.
Miskelly was 17 at the time, and he had a low IQ.
A documented low IQ.
And this confession, well, it came after hours of interrogation.
Hours, alone, just him and the police.
And it was full of inconsistencies, things that didn't add up.
Later on, Miskelly recanted, said he was pressured, that he didn't even understand what was happening.
But even without all of that, even if you just look at the confession itself, the details he gave, they didn't match the evidence at the crime scene.
Not even close.
So right away, you have these huge red flags.
But the prosecution, they latched onto that confession. It was like, it was all they had.
The media was going crazy. The whole community was terrified.
Yeah.
People wanted answers. They wanted someone to blame. And the West Memphis Three, well, they fit the narrative.
It became the scapegoats.
And it's important to remember, this was the early 90s.
The time of the satanic panic.
Right. People were afraid of everything. Heavy metal music, horror movies.
Dungeons and Dragons. Anything that seemed even remotely dark or different.
It was all seen as a sign of the devil.
And it created this atmosphere where accusations could just spiral out of control.
So you have these teenagers who are into Metallica, who are exploring the occult. And suddenly, they're not just kids anymore. They're monsters. They're capable of anything.
And that fear, it had very real consequences.
In this case, it had deadly
The
consequences.
trials themselves, they were just, well, there were so many problems.
Yeah, and remember, they were separate trials.
Right. Miskelly went first.
Then Eccles and Baldwin together.
It's like, why even do that,
It just adds to the feeling that something wasn't right here.
Absolutely. And then the evidence, or should I say the lack of evidence.
That fiber analysis, the one they said linked a fiber from the crime scene to Eccles' jacket, it was so weak.
Yeah, the science behind it, it was just, I mean, come on.
It felt like they were reaching, trying to force a connection where there wasn't one.
And then they brought in this expert on the occult.
Oh yeah, the one who said the way the boys were found, that it pointed to a satanic ritual killing.
Right, but this guy, he had no real credentials, nothing to back up his claims. It was just speculation, folklore.
But to the jury, to the community, I mean, they were already scared.
Yeah.
They wanted to believe it.
And in the end, that's what it came down to. Belief. Not facts, not evidence, just belief.
The juries delivered guilty verdicts.
All three of them.
Miskelly got life plus 40 years.
Baldwin got life.
And Eccles.
Death row.
3 teenagers. Their lives essentially over.
Yeah.
Based on what? On fear, on prejudice. It's hard to wrap your head around.
But that wasn't the end of the story.
Not even close.
Because as the years went by, things started to change. New evidence came to light, witnesses recanted.
And the doubt about what really happened that day in Robin Hood Hills, it just kept growing.
One of the biggest turning points, I think, was John Mark Byers.
Christopher Byers' adoptive father.
Right. In the beginning, he was totally convinced of their guilt. I mean, he was on TV condemning the West Memphis Three.
But then, something shifted.
He started to have doubts, started to question the evidence, the motives, the whole story.
And eventually.
He became a supporter of the West Memphis Three. He even said he believed they were completely innocent.
It's incredible, right? To go from believing so strongly in their guilt to advocating for their innocence. It makes you wonder what he saw, what he learned that changed his mind so completely.
And he wasn't the only one. Vicky Hutchison, she was a key witness for the prosecution.
The one who claimed she heard Eccles confessing.
Yeah. Well, she recanted her testimony, said she'd been pressured by the police, coerced into saying things that weren't true.
That was a big blow to the prosecution's case.
Huge. It really started to unravel their whole narrative.
And then, in 2007, there was a major breakthrough.
DNA evidence.
Finally, after all those years, they tested the DNA samples from the crime scene.
And the results were clear.
None of it matched the West Memphis Three.
Not a single trace.
Instead, they found a hair.
At the crime scene.
And it was not inconsistent with Terry Hobbs,
Stevie Branch's stepfather.
So now, you have the recanted testimonies, the doubts about the investigation, and this new DNA evidence pointing to someone else. It seemed like a slam dunk for a retrial.
You would think, right. But the legal system, it doesn't always move that quickly.
Or that fairly.
It took years of appeals, motions, legal battles, and all that time, the West Memphis Three, they were still in prison.
It must have been agonizing. To be so close to freedom, to know that you're innocent, but to still be trapped in that system.
And then in 2011, after 18 years...
they were offered a deal.
An Alford plea.
Which, I mean, it's a strange thing, right?
Yeah, you plead guilty, but you still maintain your innocence.
It's like a legal loophole.
Kind of. You're basically acknowledging that the prosecution has enough to convict you, even if you don't believe you actually did it.
It's a way to avoid a retrial, to get out of prison. But it comes at a price.
A big one.
You don't get your record cleared. You don't get any compensation for all the years you lost.
And technically, you're still considered guilty.
It must have been such a difficult decision for them, to choose between freedom and their reputation, between finally getting out and admitting to something they didn't do.
But in the end, they took the deal.
And on August 19th, 2011...
they walked free after 18 years.
But it wasn't a perfect ending, not by a long shot.
No. They were free, but the questions remained.
If they didn't kill those boys, who did?
And it really makes you think, doesn't it, about justice, about how easy it is to get things wrong, especially when you're dealing with something as horrific as this case.
Yeah, it's like the whole town, the whole country maybe was just looking for someone to blame.
They needed a target for their fear. And these three kids, with their music, their clothes, their interest in the occult, they just fit the bill.
The perfect scapegoat.
Exactly. And it's scary, because it shows how easily we can be swayed by our own biases, by the things we're afraid of.
We see what we want to see.
We believe what we want to believe. And sometimes that can lead to some pretty terrible outcomes.
Like in this case.
Exactly. And even after they were released, even after all those years in prison, the question still lingered. Who really did it?
Terry Hobbs, Stevie Branch's stepfather, He was always kind of lurking in the background, wasn't he?
Yeah, that hair they found at the crime scene, not inconsistent with his DNA. It was never enough to charge him, but
But the suspicion never really went away.
no. And Pam Hobbs, Stevie's mom, she even said she thought Terry might have been involved.
She said she found Stevie's pocket knife, the one she thought the killer took, among Terry's things after the murders.
And she said she saw him doing laundry late at night, like he was trying to get rid of something.
That's pretty damning.
It is. But again, it was never enough to prove anything in court.
So Terry Hobbs, he always maintained his innocence.
He did, and officially, the case remains unsolved.
Which means that somewhere out there, the person who killed those 3 boys, they might still be free.
It's a tough thought to swallow.
It is. And it really makes you think about the whole system, the justice system, how flawed it can be.
How easily things can go wrong, how innocent people can be caught in the gears.
The West Memphis Three case, it's a reminder that we can't just blindly trust the system.
We have to be critical. We have to question things. We have to demand evidence, not just speculation and fear.
Because if we don't, if we just let our emotions take over, then who knows how many more innocent people might end up paying the price.
Exactly. The West Memphis Three case, it's a cautionary tale, a story that should make us all stop and think about what justice really means.
And what we can do to make sure that it's served for everyone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.